Welcome back into the B-Sides of Sports. We are currently on Season 3, Episode 7, and today we're doing our first fully centered NBA pod. And so to get things started, the in-season tournament now is officially heating up. We are out of the preliminary round and now getting into, the guys who made it. And so the matchups currently sit at the Celtics at Pacers, Knicks at Bucks, Pelicans Kings, and Suns Lakers. The tournament begins December 5th. And so, Wilson, how do you want to start this segment? What do you want to talk about first?
I thought it was really interesting just to go straight to kind of how those group play games were unfolding. It was interesting to me to see how well the veteran teams were performing. And to me, that kind of keyed in that these teams were really treating these as greater than just regular season games. It truly felt like whether it was the court, the environment, just the hype leading into some of these games, that the games were treated as more of a playoff-esque game. Obviously, some of the defense in these games wasn't nearly the level that we'll see later on in the year as we get closer to the true playoff season. But you just saw teams that were extra dialed in, hustle plays, you had more guys diving for loose balls, and to me it was fun to see just so much buzz and excitement around the NBA so early on in the season. And so with that, my surprise here is that just the veteran teams performed so well. You listed off the four matchups that we have, and looking at the Celtics, Suns, Lakers, and even the Bucks, these are older rosters. And going into this kind of idea of the in-season tournament, I don't think a lot of people would have penciled in, the Lakers are going to be a team that rise to the occasion for the in-season tournament, right? You just would assume that they have kind of longer year ambitions over some, silly tournament that a lot of people labeled early on. And so it's really cool to me to just see that kind of outcome. You also have some younger teams, right? Obviously the Kings and the Pacers really get up and down the court. But again, I would have, if you would have asked me before the season, I would have expected maybe a team like the Magic, and the Magic did play well in their group play, but the Magic just come guns blazing, right? These are guys who their contracts aren't as big as some of these other rosters, and so the $500,000 incentive is a little greater to them. But at the same time, maybe I underestimated the value of that monetary incentive. And yeah, it's been really fun. I think it's been a huge success for the NBA early on. I think we'll have to see how this knockout stage goes. Obviously, a play-in March Madness type of feel here, but yeah, I think the buzz and excitement has been real, and I think the product's been good.
No, I agree. And I think it's interesting because for me, so I was a little late to get into the NBA this season. And I think part of that was just me dragging my feet. Wasn't too thrilled with the Raptors off season. So naturally, I'm going to be dragging my feet a little more. But the in-season tournament being early, I was kind of like a hater on the idea initially because I was just like, well, nothing's happened. Why would there need to be a tournament? But to me, it's kind of brought me now into the NBA. So usually where I start watching more heavy after the All-Star break, I'm watching a good amount of games before the All-Star break. And so obviously, as Wilson said, kind of curious to see how the numbers pan out, but I think it works really well. And I just think I'm excited. I also like that some of the younger teams are getting chances. You brought up the Pacers and Kings. I also kind of want to throw in Pelicans because now with Zion actually playing, I feel like we talk about them every year. We're interested to see how they do. We think they have the talent, but injuries and everything else derail them. So I think it's very interesting. And then, again, we have some of the teams we kind of expected would do good. Celtics, Bucks, Suns, the teams everyone kind of had penned in as being a conference final type team. But no, I think it's interesting. And again, I don't even know if it's the incentive as much as it is proving once again, that they're better, right? These guys are some of the most competitive people on the planet. And this is just an opportunity to literally be better, get more games on national television and show, look, I'm better than you. Right. And I think that's something that, you can never undersell. And again, it's one of the reasons why, me and Wilson have talked, we'll probably never get one-on-ones at the All-Star game or anything like that. These guys are too competitive and their pride on the line is just a little too much. But something like this, their whole team's being involved. It is a lot lower stakes. I think, though, you're seeing that competitive edge in a lot of these guys.
Yeah, that's a really good take. And just on the formatting of the tournament itself, we talked last time a bit when we talked about the tournament. The Tuesday-Friday format's excellent. Obviously, it doesn't directly conflict with the NFL on any of those nights. And Wednesday's kind of that awkward week of the day of the week where, a lot of people have either religious involvements or just different extracurricular activities going on in their lives. Choosing the Tuesday-Friday slot, I think it's really brought a lot of eyes to the NBA early on in the season, just people that regularly wouldn't be tuned in to the NBA season so early on. Just looking at the field itself, kind of just considering, who I would expect to play well in this kind of knockout format, it's hard not to like rosters like the Lakers and the Bucks, right? Just with clutch players. In the Bucks case with Damian and just knowing the Lakers' poise, Lakers have done well in their play-in opportunities over the last couple of years. And I think I would lean towards the older rosters, right? Just playing with that experience, especially just given the competitiveness that we saw out of the group play stage. I would expect us to see much of the same in the knockout rounds. The last thing I would mention about the formatting is I thought the 4 games was very appropriate for the group play. For the group play stage. Yes, it didn't feel like it was too much, right? Like, once it was established, you kind of expected what days of the week you were going to see it. The courts obviously were a huge directive to the casual eye, but with the formatting, I thought the point differential was kind of a point that has been brought up over recent days about the controversy on teams wanting to run up the scores and trying to get into this knockout stage
Yeah.
tournament. And it's tough to say, right? Like, a lot of people want to say, respect the game, and it's not about chasing stats at the end of a game that's already established. But at the same time, I understand the challenge the NBA was facing, because in this, given only 4 games of group play, head-to-head tiebreakers was going to be messy. Just given, if you beat team A beats team B beats team C, and just given, it's such a small sample size, I understand the point differential point. At the same time, I think that would be the area that the NBA would go to kind of reevaluate if everything else goes well for the tournament.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and going back to your initial point of the sort of running up the score, we saw something actually last night where Joe Mazzulla had to explain to Billy Donovan why he fouled Andre Drummond late in the fourth quarter, despite winning by over 30 points, and that was just because again they were going for the point differential. So I do think you're right. I think again, and this is the first year, so I am giving the NBA the benefit of the doubt in terms of some of this stuff. And again, I think as it's normalized, I don't think it will be seen as bad practice. I know, being a Raptors guy, DeMar DeRozan was always notoriously against running up the score. Lance Stevenson famously hit a layup, and the Raptors and Pacers got into a mid-court brawl in the late 20 teens. And again, so I get, there are certain principles in basketball that do kind of say this isn't what you should do. And again, I think the NBA will find a way around it. I also just want to say my kind of last thing on the in-season tourney was I personally loved the alternate courts. I think it's so fun. I love teams like Oregon and college football who do all these sorts of uniform changes, and I'm always so welcome to seeing some change. And again, some of the courts look terrible, but again, you have to take chances, to liven things up. So I love it, and I really do. I hope that the numbers do well enough to justify a second year of this in-season tournament.
Yeah, I just don't see a downside to it, truly, especially given that they're built-in games within the regular season already. Obviously, that championship game isn't, but I also understand just the scheduling difficulties that the NBA would face if it were to give 3 games up to this kind of chance and needing the early season to unfold. I really agree with your point about the courts, and just to follow up there, like, I would imagine that nobody would turn on a game that they're wanting to watch and go away because of the court. And so for that reason, I think it's nice that the NBA took a swing for that. And it just gave us some looks that we haven't seen before in the NBA, right? Just some color combinations. We're so used to just seeing the classic hardwood floor. And so I liked it. It definitely labeled it as the in-season tournament. And again, I just go back to the branding the NBA did for this. The marketing was super, super strong. And I hope the results show that.
Yeah. Well, and I also like how it played into the city edition jerseys, because I think that's smart because, they always have these jerseys and then they're like, oh, we'll have a night where we'll do it. Right. And it's like, okay, cool. That's cool and all, but it's not really changing anything. So like the Pacers, I went to a game actually of the in-season tournament, and cause I just kind of wanted to see what it was like. And seeing the alternate court, seeing there's just a different atmosphere. And like you said, the NBA loves to take chances, and I think this is one I'm totally cool with, and I hope we see more of this to come. And kind of something you touched on earlier to kind of swing to another topic. We saw some, sort of early team surprises come in this tournament, as well as just overall. Obviously, I think some of the teams a lot of people are pointing to are the Magic, Timberwolves, Rockets, Pacers, Knicks. Some of the teams, we didn't think we are going to have bad years, but just kind of surprised at the success. And I think we should just start off with the Rockets. Obviously, Wilson in our notes here equated them to the Jazz of last year, to where, they have a good amount of talent on the roster. They have a lot of young guys trying to prove things. So we weren't really sure, right? They're sort of in this limbo. So obviously right now, I think they sit at 8-7. Wilson, what are your kind of thoughts on the Rockets so far?
Yeah, you've got to love the offseason acquisitions that the Rockets had. Just bringing in veteran players and Brooks and Van Vliet. I think staying away from Harden, as much as, there's been controversy on whether or not that would have been a fit, I think staying away from Harden was the right move when developing so many of these young players, particularly at the guard position. And then obviously the emergence of Şengün has just been an absolute revolutionary discovery for the Rockets and just how they're able to play this year. Looking at that 8-7 record, they've stumbled as of late. They'd reeled off like 5 or 6 straight. and then they've lost a couple in a row here. And what strikes me is they very much are that young team, right? Even with the veteran additions, they're a team that plays great at home with a ton of confidence. And when they go away, you see them struggle a bit much. And that's reflected in their 8-1 record at home,
Mhm.
0-6 on the road. So, early returns for a young team. I equated them to the Jazz because I expect them kind of to have the same trajectory of that season where they're going to be a flash in the pan at moments throughout the season, and they're going to be competitive night in and night out. But obviously, they're a couple steps and a couple moves away from being a true contender. It doesn't make them any less fun to watch. And I think the most interesting thing to monitor will truly be what is the ceiling on Şengün, right? He has just been on an absolute tear, right? His
Mhm.
ability to score the ball, just the aggressiveness in which he does it. He really asserts himself as an offensive threat out there every single night. And then obviously the rebounding and the assisting, people want to compare it to that of Jokic. I definitely don't think he's on the level of Jokic, but I think, the similarities are there for a reason. And it'll just be interesting to see what that floor and ceiling looks like.
Yeah, so I pretty much wholeheartedly agree about Sagoon. I'm not going to really touch on him since I think you did a great job at really just wrapping up why I think he's such a special player. But I also think Jalen Green is a player who, he's gotten a lot of flack early in his career. Everyone was making fun of sort of like the highlight style basketball, and just when him and that team a few years ago were just so horrendous. A lot of people put the blame on him, but I think what people also have to remember is this is a guard league, and a lot of the best teams have a 30 points per game score, usually a guard, or sort of a swing forward. Obviously, there's some exceptions with guys like Jason Tatum or Nikola Jokic, Joel Embiid, but even with those guys, you're starting to see, they all have a Jamal Murray or a Tyrese Maxey. And so I think the key to the Rockets becoming a contender in the future is Jalen Green. I think he is truly the X factor on this team because he can score at such a high clip, but his efficiencies are kind of where he struggles. And with Sengun taking a step forward, he's kind of, I think, been a little more passive. And I think that's the opposite of what they need. I think they still need him going and getting his shot. I'm not a big Fred VanVleet fan, in all honesty. He was on the Raptors for years, and he's just a very inefficient shooter. So I wasn't big on how much they paid him. Same thing with Brooks. I think both of those guys are fine players. I just think kind of the nature of the NBA and sports, having to overplay guys to get them to come to you, I think is just why we saw those contracts. But they both are producing for them. So I think, there's an argument for him. And Jabari Smith is, kind of finding in his, getting up to 30 minutes a game. I think he's, kind of finding his role a little more. He's almost averaging 15 and 10. I think he's at like 14 and 8 right now. So again, solid numbers. I just think they're a really young team. They did just send Amen Thompson down to the G League. So I think they just have to be very careful. They have a young team with a lot of talent. You just really have to play your cards right. Prioritize development over wins now. And I think the Rockets could be a very talented roster in 2 or 3 years from now.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't disagree with anything you said there. And the last thing that I would add is just kind of towing that line for the Rockets. And I would say it about the Jazz, excuse me, again from last year too, but really kind of prioritizing, you're right, not chasing wins necessarily, but finding ways to win and establishing a winning culture, I think is super important. And it gets lost kind of in today's lottery era, right? A lot of teams want to think if they're not, if they're going to be stuck in that play-in range, a lot of teams would rather just be worse and have a higher pick. But I think we've seen it with a bunch of these rosters, and we'll talk about Detroit at length later on in this podcast. Detroit can amass a top 5 pick every year, and they're still not going anywhere. And at one point, you've got to consider just the locker room energy and just the way of basketball that the team is playing, right? If it's not done the right way, if they're not doing the little things as the front office prioritizes getting a higher pick, I think those are details that really matter when you're trying to take the next step. So I really respect how Udoka's coaching the team right now, and it's been really fun to watch.
Yeah, no, I agree. And now switching over to the Magic, I actually just kind of want to start this one off because I think to me, what they're doing is how you build a young roster and how you turn it into a contender. What they've done and the roster management, I think, especially of this team, is just so fantastic. It really feels like they get the most out of all of their players. Switching Cole Anthony to be a true sixth man this year has helped them tremendously, averaging 15 off the bench. He's really just a floor general for that second unit. And then you throw in Bankero and Franz. And I mean, there's just so much young talent on this roster. I think going into the offseason this year, I don't think, in all honesty, they're going to make waves. I don't think they're an Eastern Conference final caliber team yet. But what I do think they are now is a good team who can attract some quality free agents, get a good veteran in that locker room. And I really think if they get one just splash signing next year, I really think they can compete for the East.
Yeah, and it's Florida, right? Like the Orlando market, while not
Mhm.
necessarily one of the NBA's premier ones, it's not a bad market to be in. And so, it's definitely not outside the realm of possibility that they're able to pick up a huge free agent acquisition on the market. Yeah, I agree with you. The top to bottom youth talent on this roster is just really fun to watch. Starting with Boncaro and Wagner, they've just been terrific picks for the Magic. And I think the hierarchy that's starting to form within the roster. You mentioned Cole Anthony being willing to come off the bench and play that sixth man scorer role. I think the chemistry and the hierarchy that's forming on that team is really going to serve them a large distance here. Boncaro, to me, has kind of gone under the radar, as a super, one of the number one overall picks over the last couple of years, had a really quiet rookie of the year campaign. And, I just think, with some of the superstars that are up and coming, particularly on the American side of basketball, I think he gets lost in one of those up and coming young names because truly, he's a double walk-in, right? He's going to get you
Mhm.
20 points and 10 assists. 10 rebounds any given night. And so they're just a ton of fun to watch. I think they are playing with a little bit of house money early on in the season. They're catching a lot of people off guard. But at the same time, I do expect them to be in that playoff hunt. I don't expect them to regress to a 500 or even below 500 team. So it'll be super fun to just watch how the Magic continue to play.
Yeah, no, I agree. And just, I think, again, my last thing on them is I do just want to sing praises for Paolo Banchero. When we were talking about him early in our podcast, I said that I think he was the definite number one in that class. And what I thought was a pretty special player. Again, don't know if he's generational, but just watching the way he conducted himself at Duke, the way he plays basketball, it is so just. It looks good. He plays basketball well. He's shooting 40% from three as a power forward. And again, he's not attempting a ton of threes per game, but just everything he does well. And I think that's exactly what you need for a leader of your young team. And I'm also a big fan of Cole Anthony off the bench. I just think that's been such a smart decision. I think he's averaging 15, 4, and 4, and just really putting together a six man of the year campaign potentially, and showing, again, how you can run a young team. A little later, we're going to go on how you shouldn't manage a young roster. And I just think they perfectly contradict one of the teams we were going to talk about later. So I won't spoil that, but
Yeah, absolutely fair. With that, then we can turn over to kind of the last two teams in this early season success story category, right? And that being the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Oklahoma City Thunder. For both of these rosters, to me, what sticks out is they really have two of the top 10, top 15 talents emerging in the league right now, and SGA and Ant-Man. And, what the two of them are doing on a night in and night out basis, we can't give enough credit to them as the head of these snakes, right? And I think both teams are overachieving thus far. I think both of them were expected to kind of be in that playoff hunt. I don't know if people would have penciled in the Timberwolves as the number one seed and the Thunder as a borderline top four seed, but that's what we have thus far into the season. And again, I just can't compliment the roster construction for both of those teams. The OKC has gotten a lot of flack over the last couple of years for just their acquisition of the draft picks, right? A lot of people thought, you can't just amass, 30 first round picks over a 10-year period and expect it to amount to something. But at the same time, I do think there's an element of they were able to swing on so many picks, and credit to them, they hit on a bunch of them. But you're really seeing that roster come together top to bottom. And then with the Timberwolves, really, it's just, I think Ant has really been the piece that's taken it to the next level. Karl Anthony Towns, we can talk about his floor, we can talk about his ceiling. The truth is, he's a pretty good player. He might not be reaching the potential that a lot of people wanted him to reach, but he's pretty good. And then paired with Rudy Gobert in that that front court line, and it's a really good, just tons of length, tons of athleticism. So both of those rosters have been just a bundle of energy. They play with so much on both sides of the court. They're a hard matchup for everyone in the league, just given their size. And so, again, two other teams that have just been super fun to watch early on.
yeah, no, I agree. And I think what makes both these teams special is it also just seems like, the passion for the game is there. Anthony Edwards is, I've said a million times, one of my favorite young players in the league. And I just really think that both of these teams they both have their guys, right? So now it's all just about surrounding them. And I think both of them have an interesting sort of future now, because I think the Timberwolves, if I'm them, Cat's contract, I think you have to move it. You went with Gobert, and it seems like you want that. Karl Anthony Towns is a really good player that you could move and get a lot of really good players or picks for him. Maybe get a little younger to give Anthony Edwards some young guns around him. Meanwhile, Oklahoma is the opposite. You have all these picks. You have all these guys. Maybe you can trade some of those picks for an older player to get that veteran to maybe take you over. So I think, like you said, both of them were great on roster acquisition, did it very different ways. But I just think both have set themselves up for success. And I'm very interested to see mainly how the Timberwolves more than anyone, because I think Oklahoma City with all their draft picks, I think we know how they're going to build, just throw those picks at people. But I think the Timberwolves have a little more interesting of one, considering they don't have the draft picks. So maybe trading, a guy like I said, Karl Anthony Towns, to get some of those picks back to try and really build a contender might be a move for them. I mean, Karl Anthony Towns is a great player, like you said, hasn't necessarily reached his potential in Minnesota, but maybe, he goes somewhere else and can reach it. So very interested to see how both these teams play out, and how, again, I think these aren't necessarily teams that are going to win this year, but I think they're kind of looking, for the next 3-year window. And I think both of them are kind of in that category. So curious to see how they build into that 3-year window.
Super, super fair. I think as we start to round out our A block, the last thing that I really wanted to touch on, just amidst this NBA conversation that we've been having, is kind of the element of the first, second, and third year players around the league, to me, seem to be contributing at a higher level than we've had over recent memory. We've talked about a lot of the guys that have been contributing, but we can just look at the rookies right now. Chet is playing a huge role for the OKC Thunder. He's truly a member of that starting lineup. He's just not out there to kind of get the experience. He's really contributing to their success. Obviously, we know that the talent that Wemby has possessed thus far, obviously it's not resulting in any winning for the Spurs. And truly, again, just across the league, it seems like we're seeing a lot of these younger players really contribute. And I kind of wanted to pitch a theory to you that I was looking up and down the standings and kind of was trying to gander why we're seeing so many of these younger rosters have a ton of early season success. And what came to mind to me was what we're seeing is a lot of the older rosters have gone away from a lot of the load management this year, right? They're sneaking it in once every 2 or 3 weeks, but for the most part, guys like LeBron, Steph, KD, Jimmy Butler, these guys are playing night in and night out. And a lot of that is probably boosted by the 65 game requirement that the NBA has put on the end of season awards, And I think, at these players at the back of their mind, they know, you might get chipped up with a hamstring or something that might keep you out for 2 weeks. Right there, that's going to be 6 or 7 games that you're immediately cut out of that 82. And so early on in these seasons, I think teams are trying to be super conservative with how they go about their load management. And because of that, I think what we're seeing is older players obviously take a lot longer to kind of get accustomed and acclimated to the season. And I think on the flip side, the younger players and their energy that they're bringing, just trying to fight for their NBA careers, really contributing to a lot of younger teams having success early on in the season. We mentioned all of those teams, so just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it like that, in all honesty. I think it's interesting because, like you said, we are seeing a lot of younger players sort of, again, really step into the spotlight this year. I do think the 65 game requirement was a good thing, just to kind of touch on that as well, because I do think it just kind of sets a baseline, which we didn't have before. And with this load management era, I think you just unfortunately do need one. As well as I also think the G League is something that's helping young players, because as we've seen, a lot of lottery picks have already been sent down to the G League. I mentioned one of the Thompson brothers, as well as Grady Dick for the Raptors just got sent down, and Scoot Henderson was there for a little bit rehabbing an injury. So I think that's interesting. And Chet also, I think, again, he's the Ben Simmons rookie, right, where he had a whole year with the team due to an injury. So again, I don't really consider him a rookie, even though he is technically. But I will say, I think the attributing to winning, I think maybe is true, because like you said, especially with teams like maybe the Pacers, right, who are really just their goal is to score 150 every night, and they're like, we'll let you score 152 if you want to. And with teams like Orlando, right, we're young, we are going to run the floor. All of our starters are under 25 years old. Same thing with OKC. I think that's interesting take, and I don't know if it'll necessarily hold as the year goes on, but definitely I like the theory and curious to see how it plays out as time goes on.
Absolutely.
And with that, our A block will come to our close, and with B block, we will touch on the head coaching carousel that is currently happening in the NFL.
Welcome back in to the B-Sides of Sports. This is our B block, and like Drake just mentioned a moment ago, we're going to be talking about the NFL coaching carousel. I think personally it's one of my favorite topics that Drake and I talk about each year. I think it's just super interesting to kind of go away from the players for a brief moment and look at the coaching and kind of the circumstances around them. So that's what we're doing today, and this is on the heels of the report from Adam Schefter that up to a third of the league could see new coaching positions, whether it's via firings, via trade, just think different things amongst that. So just to recap some of the firings that have happened so far, and Drake will dive into these in a moment. We obviously saw Matt Canada leave the Pittsburgh Steelers as their OC. Frank Reich was fired as the head coach for the Panthers. Josh McDaniels and his OC Mick Lombardi were fired for the Raiders, and Ken Dorsey departed the Bills given their offensive struggles early on in the season. So Drake, where do you want to start with the firings that have already happened?
So I think with the firings, I want to start with the teams who we have seen befores and afters of the coaching. Because, like, for example, Matt Canada, 44 games use offensive coordinator, 44 games they went under 400 yards. The first game he's fired, they score 400 points. Now again, or they score 400 points. That'd be crazy. They have 400 offensive yards. Now, they did only get 16 points, and they barely won with a backup team with Joe Burrow, but it was a game plagued by mistakes. Deontay Johnson had a touchdown catch broken up in the end zone. They had a fumble that a bunch of the players didn't know was a live ball, get taken back for Cincy. So I'm going to kind of call that growing pains, and also, again, having a new offensive coordinator. But again, that this already looks like a good firing. I mean, all the players had pretty much come out publicly in their post-game press conferences, said the offense was predictable and we're sick of him. So I just don't even know really how they would have gone back from that. And I think they finally did just move on from it. So I think that was smart for them. And again, same thing with Josh McDaniels, of a team looking night and day better the second they're there. Antonio Pierce comes in, immediately makes the decision. Look, we're starting Aiden O'Connell. Jimmy Garoppolo is not getting it done. Brian Hoyer is not getting it done. Let's look at our young quarterback. And he's showing them what they have with him. He looks like a very competent young quarterback, throwing for over 200 yards in 3 of his 4 starts. Devontae Adams is finally getting the ball again. Josh Jacobs is having a resurgence. Really, again, just another firing that's making the team look night and day better. And as we've seen some of the reports come out, we're starting to think that the Josh McDaniels thing might have been slightly an ego thing, as well as just not being a normal human being running that team. And then to touch on the last one that we have results for, you have Ken Dorsey firing. Since he's been fired, they have scored in 2 games 66 points. An absurd 66 points against 2 incredible teams. The Eagles are not teams, but a great team in the Eagles and a great defense in the Jets. So again, this is another firing. Josh Allen is getting back to being Josh Allen. Just looks like their issues are getting fixed. So looking at the firing so far, I think they were all necessary. Now, the Frank Reich one, I think more is that of a organizational failure than a head coach failure. Obviously, Dave Tepper sort of being the Jerry Jones of that team and running things. Frank Reich was outspoken in wanting C.J. Stroud. They just didn't get C.J. Stroud. And then he struggles with the quarterback he's given, and he gets fired. Now, I'm not a Frank Reich fan as a head coach. I don't think he's a great head coach, but I still think he just kind of got screwed, and Dave Tepper is single-handedly ruining the Carolina Panthers, and I think that's more of the story with them rather than a head coach. I think firing a head coach when your idiot owner is making a ton of errant decisions can only do so much for you.
Yeah, I agree with everything you outlined there, particularly with just, I think, the Canada, Reich, McDaniels, and Lombardi firings we could have seen coming probably even before the season. In Reich's defense, obviously handing out the big contract, it's always tough to see teams depart from that, but just given the quarterback kind of disalignment there that was happening, I wasn't really expecting to see a full season there. On the Ken Dorsey side, this is the one that came as a bit more of a surprise to me. And what I would pitch is that if the Bills special teams doesn't make that error and the Broncos do miss that field goal, is he really fired the next day, right? Like that's kind of what I would have pitched. At the same time, you're right. The offensive output has been much better since his departure. And again, to me, it's just interesting to see how, a OC and his quarterbacks development can kind of have been up and down, and really that's just a summary of how the Bills are, right? They're so up and down week in and week out. But I think there was a point where Ken Dorsey was going to be considered for head coaching positions, right? Like just looking at that Bills offense, when it's on, it hums. And that was even with him at the OC position after the departure of Brian Daboll. And the turnovers have obviously been a huge problem. I think, when it comes to, they're never going to depart from Josh Allen, right? Like the blame is never going to fully fall on the shoulders of Josh. So I understand the departure there. Again, that was just the most surprising one to me.
Yeah, see, the Ken Dorsey firing for me made sense. My roommate from college, Roger, is a big Bills fan. So almost every week I'm texting him during the game. And I think what was just so frustrating about Ken Dorsey was his lack of commitment to establishing the run game. And I know, this is kind of like one of the most casual, like football memes, right? The more general ones, why do you run a guy up the middle? If it's just going to get 3 yards, why don't you run around? The Bills kind of took that to heart. The Andy Reid philosophy. We just don't have to run the football if we don't want to. We'll replace that with short routes and, Stephon Diggs on a little 5-yard in route or things like that, or Dalton Kincaid on a short out or a little hitch. It just doesn't work. And time again, you see and you look at teams with struggles, and they've run the ball over 30 times now in back-to-back games since firing Ken Dorsey. And I think his lack of commitment to the run game, and again, Ty Johnson has been getting a big share of targets, their third string running back. And to me, that just shows a team that realized what they were doing wasn't working, so we have to change it. And Ken Dorsey wasn't doing that. They were just kind of running their head into the wall. Dalton Kincaid has come into his own these last few weeks. And I think a big part of that also is Ken Dorsey getting firing. And again, sometimes you just have to understand whoever's getting open is getting open, and let's just get them the ball. Let's keep getting them plays to get them open. And James Cook is a fantastic young player, and him just getting like 10 to 11 touches a game was ridiculous to me. And since Dorsey has now been fired, he's just had the ball in his hands so much more. He had 21 touches in the Jets games, and then he goes back the next week and has 25. I just getting the balls in the hands of your playmakers that aren't necessarily Stephon Diggs. Josh Allen's been running the ball more. Again, using what you have at your disposal. I just don't think Ken Dorsey was doing that.
I think that's a really good analysis of kind of the football reasons for why that departure had to happen. So really like that there. With that, we'll move on to our list of coaches, just given the reports that have come out, coaches that should be on high alert, and quite an extensive list here. We've kind of narrowed it down to just, 7 or 8 candidates. So we'll kind of just go down the line here, Drake. We'll start with Brandon Staley for the Chargers.
Yeah, Staley, in my opinion, it's just when you're a defensive guy, you come into a team and your defense is never better than 21st overall in the 3 years, and you're wasting your young quarterback. I just don't see a defense for him staying there besides the Spanos family lack of money.
Fair. And, Justin Herbert right now sitting at below 500 in his career. We talked about the talent. We've talked about it so many times. And given just how promising his rookie season looked, at one point you've just got to switch it up. And I know Staley's not on the offensive side of the ball for them, but you've just got to make a change when you're operating an organization like that.
Well, and also my last thing on them is it just, they get into so many of these close games where they're having to go for a lot of 4th and 1s, which Staley loves doing, even though they suck at them. And I look at their roster management, and Austin Eckler is struggling this year. And again, I think it's a lot of things going into that. The team not believing in him, giving him the extension, as well as, again, I just don't think they're a team really built to run or built to do anything well. Their 3 starting wide receivers are all massive giants who aren't necessarily guys, you can go to on quick 4th and 1s or things like that. So they're guys who need a little bit of time for their routes to develop. Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Quentin Johnston, Donald Parham, Gerald Everett. All of these dudes are above 6'3", great talent, but they don't have this sort of slot guy, right? Your underneath guy, I'm going to make a play on 4th, Deontay Johnson, Tyreek Hill, Tyler Boyd, right? These sort of guys they're smaller, but they're quick. They can get open fast. They don't need time for things to develop. And again, that falls onto the head coach. He's going for all these 4th and 1s. And so many times the guys just aren't even remotely open because the routes have just started by the time Herbert's getting hit. Brandon Staley is just a masterclass in how to mismanage a roster and how not to build a contender, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, that's really sound analysis. And it's ironic, right? He was kind of the analytics guy when he came into the league, right? The Chargers went for it on 4th down more than anyone. And now it's a thing that truly is kind of starting to bite them in the back. Mm-hmm. Moving on, we have Sean Payton, and really the case of Payton here, he's really turned the Broncos season around. Obviously that start looked even worse than last year's Broncos, but since then they've reeled off 5 in a row, and they truly look like a competent NFL roster top to bottom. They are in kind of that wild card, could sneak in position. So I wouldn't really say Sean Payton's on the hot seat, but thought we could take a moment just to talk about the up and down of his coaching for the Broncos this year.
Yeah, no, and for what they gave up for him, there was no way they were going to fire him unless they didn't win a game the entire season. Trading a 1st rounder for him and signing him to that massive contract, they wouldn't have. But something I just want to point out, and I think we aren't talking about it enough, is he's an offensive guy. They brought him in to change the offense, and Russell Wilson still just does not look like his former self. He's only thrown for 200 yards in one of their last 5 games on this impressive win streak. It has just been, again, the defense, and he's not a defensive coach, and they had those guys when he got there. To me, Sean Payton has done absolutely nothing except coach to not lose and pray that the team can win. I still am not big on him, and I think the Broncos for the next 4 years of his contract are just going to muddle around and not do a whole lot of nothing.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And the Broncos, looking at their next three, I know this is kind of off the coaching a little bit, but they're on the road, and I don't necessarily expect them to continue winning. Your point about Russell Wilson's exactly right. The numbers look good on paper. I think 20 touchdowns to 4 interceptions. But at the same time, if you look at the game plan and how the play calls are unfolding, it's a super conservative game plan. He's not taking a lot of deep shots downfield. They're hardly asking him to, design, scramble. And, I just don't think the results have been a little different the last couple of games, but to me, we're seeing a similar version of Wilson that we saw last year. And given the contract that they signed him to as well, that Peyton Wilson ceiling to me is going to have a really, really hard ceiling that they're not going to be able to get past with both of those contracts for the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think they will at best be a 10-win team and at most be, or most often be sort of that 7-8 win team, just because, again, they have the talent. The defense is insane. They have talent on offense as well. They have 3 solid running backs, but I just think incompetent head coaching as well as below average quarterback pay for top dollar is not how you win football games in the NFL.
Absolutely. Next up, we have Ron Rivera for the Washington Commanders. And, a lot's been made about the Commanders this year. Obviously, the passing offense has been gaudy at times. But again, it's a team that's sitting at 4-8. And Ron Rivera has really just truly never felt like the right fit for this team.
Yeah, I agree. And I just think it's since the new management taking over, I just don't think they wanted to come in and make a real splash move. Hence why I said, there's reports coming out last week that they're going to keep him till the end of the year. He is an old head coach. He does have that pedigree. You do have to trust him within a certain regard. But for being a guy nicknamed Riverboat Ron, the conservative nature of his play calling, as well as the just utter embarrassment that is that O-line, is just, it's a little disappointing to see that this is how he goes out. And again, he's getting older. This might be one of his last head coaching gigs, and really just not the way you really want to see him go out, but just kind of is how the way things work in the NFL.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Next up, we have Matt Eberflus for the Chicago Bears. And again, this is one of those sticky situations where Fields has been on and off the field, and the Bears are in a position where they're not really incentivized to lose anymore, given that they have the Panthers picks. But at the same time, the results have not been that promising. I'm still a little up and down on Fields, and I don't necessarily know if Eberflus is the right head coach pairing for him. But I think if it were up to me, I would sell on Eberflus faster than I would sell on Fields. Your thoughts?
Yeah, my thinking is I think you just need to blow up that whole front office and then bring in a new front office and then ask them what they want, because you do have a very rare position where they'll probably be picking number 1 and then have a top 10 pick as well, based on what we've seen so far. So looking at that, if I'm a GM and head coach, I look at Justin Fields and if you don't want him, you can trade him for a pretty solid haul. And then you still have 2 first-round picks. You can get whatever quarterback you want, and then a top talent to put at receiver to pair with DJ Moore, or get an offensive lineman. You have Joe Alt, very talented player, or Marvin Harrison, who some people herald as the best player in the draft. So if I'm looking at as the Bears, I just think you need to clean house and then go from there. I don't think it's an indictment on Justin Fields at all. I just want to make that clear. I don't think he's a lost cause, but I just think, again, I don't think if him and the Bears are ever going to work with the current regime.
Yeah, no, I think that's completely fair. Front office blow up might be the move to go there. Next up, we'll move on to the NFC South. We'll look at 2 of the teams here with the Buccaneers and Todd Bowles, as well as the Falcons and Arthur Smith. For various reasons here, I think both of these coaches have come under fire for their decision-making and just kind of the guys they're putting at the field at just various points in the season. Obviously, Arthur Smith has been under a boatload of criticism and controversy, just given the snaps and when Bijan Robinson is not on the field. What are your thoughts on both of these NFC head coaches?
So I'm not big on Arthur Smith, but I think he's saved by being in a terrible division. He has a losing record and is currently in the playoffs right now. I think he will make the playoffs, and I doubt the team will move on. Arthur Blank is notorious for dragging his feet on coaching change decisions. So my guess is Arthur Smith gets a few more years. I'm personally not big on him. But again, it is what it is. I just don't think there's much point in debating it, because I think it's all but said and done that he's not going to get fired. But with Todd Bowles, I think it's a little more interesting. You're just a few years removed from a Super Bowl. Baker Mayfield is on pace to be a top 10 quarterback, statistically speaking. You have a ton of talent on that roster, and it's underachieving in about every way possible in a division that's very winnable. And that comes back to Todd Bowles. He's extremely passive as a head coach. He's a defensive head coach, and there's a theme of these guys not panning out as good head coaches. If you you look, Brandon Staley, defensive head coach, Ron Rivera, Matt Eberflus, Todd Bowles, Sean McDermott, all of these guys except Arthur Smith and Sean Payton came from defensive backgrounds. So, and you're seeing a trend of it just sort of not working. So I also just, again, trends are trends for a reason. I'm out on Todd Bowles. I just think it's a shame to see Baker Mayfield and this offense really just be pretty horrendous. They have Rashad White, a very talented young running back, yet they're still 31st in the league in offense, or 32nd in the league in overall rushing offense. It's about as terribly managed as a talented team can get besides the Chargers.
Yeah, and in such an uncompetitive division, it is really just a shame to see so much talent go to waste. This is a division that you can win with 8 or 9 wins easily. You could win going away with 9 almost. And you're right. For the Bucs have as much roster and the start they had, they're really underperforming at this point in the season, and a lot of that has just got to fall on the head coach, in my opinion. Yep. The last coach we'll end with here is Sean McDermott. Sean McDermott for the Buffalo Bills. And again, just the up and down nature of this Bills season has a lot of people questioning the pairing. I always like to throw out the stat: if a head coach and a quarterback don't win a Super Bowl within their first 5 years as a duo, it never goes on to happen. And Sean McDermott and Josh Allen are now past that 5-year window. So to me, I think a change has to happen, even if it's not necessarily that Sean McDermott is the problem. If he's not the problem, he's clearly not the solution. And they've got to get over the hump when they've got someone as talented as Josh Allen under center.
No, I agree. And I think just the bigger thing to me with Sean McDermott is I think Brandon Beane is one of the better GMs in the league, and he's consistently getting him more and more talent, more playmakers on both sides of the ball. And again, you can only use injuries as a crutch for so long. There are guys who win through it all. And I think Sean McDermott just isn't one of those guys. I think he is a Sean Payton, Mike McCarthy, Mike Tomlin, where he's good enough to get you in the playoffs, but I just will never take those guys over any of the true high caliber head coaches in the league. To me, they are just the best as a coach can physically be without being a Super Bowl caliber coach.
Absolutely. And, there's a lot of kind of cracks in the proverbial armor for the Bills, particularly on the coaching side. The Bills are 0-6 in OT. Obviously, they haven't been great down the stretch. The clock management has been a little suspect to me at times, calling timeouts when I don't think they really need to, and then not using timeouts at times that I think they should call them. I just do think a head coaching change has to happen there for the Bills to kind of get over the hump and kind of just the cloud that's been hanging over them since that AFC title game.
For sure.
With that, then, that'll close out our B block. We thank you guys for listening to the NFL segment, and we'll jump back in with a little bit of NBA as we close out this week's podcast in just a moment. Welcome back into the B-Sides of Sports. This is our C block, and for this week, we wanted to do a little game centered around the NBA called NBA Franchise Future. So with this, I'm going to be listing some teams in the Eastern Conference for Drake, and I'm going to be asking him to categorize each franchise as a disaster, directionless, or promising. In those 3 categories, just given how the front office is structured, the current roster they have going, and just kind of the direction that the team should take their team. And, directionless being one of the categories, some of these teams are probably stuck in a little bit of limbo. So we're going to start with the very controversial Washington Wizards.
Me and Wilson have talked about this before. I actually do think they are promising. And that is just from a standpoint of they're finally blowing it up. They're finally hitting the reset button. For so many years with Wall and Beal, they just stuck to that sort of 30 to 40 win team. But now they're finally acquiring young talent, signing guys like Tyus Jones, who I think can be a really fantastic point guard for this roster. They also have guys like Kyle Kuzma and Jordan Poole, who, again, I think with the right coach and the right players around them can be a really talented roster. They have solid veterans and guys like Shamet and Gallinari, yet they're a terrible team. And I think that's good for them because I think you have to just be bad. You need some organizational changes. You need to get a young, one of these top 5 guys, right? One of these, Duke guys or UNC, these all-time talents, get them in there. You have a bunch of talent to put around them, but I think they actually have a future. So I'm going to say lightly promising as a team.
Yeah, the Wizards are the team, Drake alluded to it, that he and I see a little bit differently on. I wouldn't quite call them directionless, and while disaster seems a little bit harsh, just given the limited talent they do have on that roster, that is the word I'm going to land on for them here. And it really is just centered around kind of this notion that they signed Jordan Poole to a huge contract, expecting him to be able to be a lead guard. And to me, what we just see is the exact same version of Jordan Poole we had on the Warriors, except he's unleashed and a little bit more reckless. Just being around such a veteran team last year, they were able to reel him in at points. And, if he wasn't playing super well, they were able to keep him off the floor in closing time. Obviously, the Wizards don't have that luxury. And the results have been mixed, clearly in the loss column. The Wizards are, I think only behind Detroit in the standings in terms of being the worst NBA team by roster. And promising, disaster. I think here it really depends. A couple moves could really flip them in one direction more than the other pretty rapidly. So maybe that's why you'll lean with promising a bit more than I would. But I just don't love the Jordan Poole signing. I think it's been a disaster since day one. And I think to trade Jordan Poole is when they would really unlock that level of promising. But who knows? I could be wrong in my evaluation of him as a talent.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been kind of big on Poole. Just because I do think he can score at such a high clip when he's put in the right scenario. We saw it 2 years ago, mainly with the Warriors, with a good head coach was able to really just unlock his potential. And then he was coming off the bench too. So, I mean, he's averaging almost 20 off the bench. So I think, again, as a starter, he can do that. I just think they need to get a good head coach in there and really just put up a little more foundational support on that roster.
Fair. Next up, we have the Detroit Pistons. Again, one of these teams that has truly underperformed, even if you didn't have them on a super high over-under win total going into the NBA season. But obviously, Detroit's been winless for quite a stretch of time here now.
I have to go disaster with them. They are I was reading an article the other day that they are getting a game probably flexed off NBA TV against the Lakers, which means the NBA is okay with taking LeBron off primetime because the Detroit Pistons are that bad. And honestly, I think that's really all I need to say about the roster. So many talented young players, but just terrible organizational, just an organizational disaster is what that team is.
I echo you completely. They've got so many high round picks, right? Even the Killian Hayes signing, they insist on putting him in that starting lineup, and the results have truly just not panned out the way they want them to. They picked up number two overall young centers in the lottery, that being Marvin Bagley III as well as James Wiseman. And both of those guys are hardly seeing the floor, in and out of the lineup with injuries at times, but clearly not going to be able to contribute to any type of winning that team's going to do. And again, I'm going to land in that disaster category as well. They're the complete opposite of Orlando to me, right? They've got all the young chips, but they've got none of the results and none of the promising aspects. Even Cade has underperformed to an extent. So really, really low on my Detroit stock. Then we'll move to the Chicago Bulls. The Bulls are a team, to me, that's a little bit in limbo. Obviously, they've got a lot of borderline star talent in Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan, even Vucevic to an extent, but the roster, again, is underperforming. It looks like they're going to be fighting for just a spot in the play-in. Which category are you putting the Chicago Bulls in, Drake?
I think in comparison to their talent, to me, they are the worst team in the league because you do have all of these players like Lonzo Ball, DeMar DeRozan, Zach LaVine, Vucevic, Patrick Williams, guys who I would consider starters on most teams in the league, and a guy like Carousel, and you're just so horrendous. Their starting five has the worst offensive rating of any starting five, and it has 3 really solid scorers. You just can't have that. This is the worst of the worst, in my opinion.
Yeah, and directionless is where I've got to go here, right? Like, as much as it's been a disaster, Chicago also just feels like one of those teams where they're refusing to commit in either direction. I guess they've tried to go all in on winning, but the results have been super underwhelming. And at the same time, they're not putting themselves in a position to have a true high lottery pick with potential. And the roster's so old that even bringing in young talent, I don't think it would do them any good. So directionless is where I have the Chicago Bulls. And then finally, we'll end off here with the Charlotte Hornets. And the Hornets, like a lot of NBA teams nowadays, are surrounded by a myriad of controversies. Obviously, reintegrating Miles Bridges into that lineup has come with a bunch of up and downs, both on and off the court. And we now see LaMelo struggling with a lot of ankle injuries, similar to how Steph Curry had early on in his career. So, a young team with a lot of talent, but at the same time, that talent's not really realizing its potential for one reason or another. To me, I've got to put the Charlotte Hornets in the directionless category. It just feels like they're going to be in that middle ground for the next couple of years, but curious to hear your thoughts.
No, I agree. And to me, it's just disappointing because they do have so many interesting talents, but it seems like everything with the Hornets we've heard the last few years has been everything but basketball. Hearing about Jordan selling the team and just the awful management that he had with that team. As soon as Terry Rozier goes down with an injury for a few games, they just look horrendous. They can't move the ball well. I just think it's very disappointing because then they get a young, very exciting talent like Brandon Miller, who again was clouded by stuff off the court. It just seems like they just can't figure it out. One of the more disappointing teams as a whole, in my opinion, in the NBA. And again, that LaMelo stuff is very scary if I was them, because he really does look like the best player on that roster. So if he really is due to be sort of this curse with injuries early in his career, that could spell the beginning of the end for a franchise that already has such a bleak outlook.
Yeah, and not to pile on the Hornets here, but even the Kai Jones situation, right? Obviously let him go, but it just seems like a roster that there's no sort of hierarchy at all, whether it's the front office, the coaching, or even just the team dynamic. And to me, that's truly what makes the team directionless, right? When there's no sense of order, nobody knows what's going on, and the management's a mess. It's the worst spot to be in all of sports, right? When you're just in that middle, you're too good to bottom out, but you're just sticking around, and you're making headlines for all the wrong reasons. That's the Charlotte Hornets for me.
Well, and I think consistently, if a controversy happens on your team once, like if it was just Miles Bridges, but it's Kai Jones, and it's the Jordan situation having to sell the team, and then it's Brandon Miller pre-draft, like and LaMelo Ball himself is a very controversial player. The Big Baller Brand lawsuit that's happening. It's everything off the court. And it's like at a certain point, you start to realize why guys don't mess with players like that, because it just is an unnecessary distraction that takes away from the team. And it's just disappointing to me, because I do just feel bad for all these young guys on this team and the older players as well, because it just feels like they're never even going to get a chance to get going.
Absolutely. With that, then, we'll close out this episode 7 of our season 3 of the B-Sides of Sports. We appreciate you guys for sticking around, and we'll be back soon with another episode this upcoming Sunday as we relaunch into the middle of the NFL season as we quickly are approaching the playoffs. Appreciate the support, and we'll see you then.